We do have Ben Safari on the line with us here from Australia. So he'll be with us in the presentation. Now I'm going to turn over to John Sewell, who I introduced a little bit earlier today. Thank you.
Ben can pick up the conversation here. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been told I have to get you started right on time. The management has threatened that the last person back in the room gets to raise money for the next conference by this distinguished group. I'm John Sewell. I've been asked to moderate this panel. It's a terribly important subject. I was very interested in listening to the morning session about the nature of the problem. Not yet completely clear, but I must say the level of preparedness and planning for the next bad drought, whether it's large or whether it's restricted to smaller pockets of people who do not have access to food because of drought, is very encouraging, because I got engaged in the Sahel, which is a fascinating place. You can't hear back there? Is this better? Okay. It's one of the disadvantages of being relatively tall. This is not a new problem, as everybody in the room knows. It's been going on a long time. The U.S. got, I think, deeply involved for the first time in the extensive famine of 1973. And here we are decades later, still talking about the same issues. Now, you'll get answers from this panel. And then, as they're going to try and hold their remarks to 10 or 12 minutes each, we'll have an extensive time for questions from the floor, discussions, dissents, whatever you wish. And we will break sharply at 12 when the meeting will be summarized by Emmy Simmons, who has just walked into the room in a beautiful orange coat, who, as many of you know, is an expert in these areas. So let me start off. We're going to start off with Jacques Higgins, then go to Benjamin Safari, who is, to his great credit, in Australia, and who is operating on a totally different time clock than people in this room, and we very much appreciate you doing that. And then to Mira Shikar, who is the expert on nutrition, and finally with Gregory Gottlieb, who is Deputy Assistant Administrator for AIDS, Bureau for Food Security. And I'm not going to introduce them. You have their bios. They've all had distinguished careers in one way or another in the issues that we're talking about today. So without further ado, let me ask Jacques Higgins to start off, and we will go from there.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you very much for inviting WFP to be part of this event. I think it's very important. Let me perhaps maybe start just to say that a comprehensive response in the Sahel really needs to be in line with a multi-dimensional reality that we have in the Sahel. If we look at the natural catastrophes in the Sahel, in the past decade or more, we've had several catastrophes, one after the other. We had a catastrophe, well, we had crisis in 2000, 2004, 2005, 2009, 2010, and on top of that, we had the high food price crisis of 2008. And what this has resulted, it's resulted in weakening the resilience and the coping strategies of the population in the Sahel. And now what we have a situation where after a crisis, people are not able anymore to recover, to rebuild their coping strategies and resilience until the next crisis hits. So what we have in the Sahel is really a crisis of resilience, and I really want to stress that point here. Now, this crisis in resilience has been also compounded by some structural weaknesses in the region, and those structural weaknesses include, for example, the highest rate of poverty on the planet, the lowest rates of human development on the planet. We have really a lot of lack of basic services in the Sahel, including nutrition, including sanitation, health, and so on. and also in terms of education. And on top of that, we have a situation where there is intense pressure from climate change onto the environment. And one of the reasons why we have so many recurrent and frequent and severe crises now in the Sahel is because in part of climate change. And on top of that, what you have in the Sahel is also a population explosion. If you look at Niger, for example, on average, every woman has 7 children. So, which means with all of these factors put together, in the Sahel, we've come to a situation of chronic food insecurity in the Sahel through the years, and also a situation of quasi-permanent state of malnutrition in the Sahel. If you look at the situation, malnutrition in the Sahel is very high, and very high even in years of good harvest. It's very high also throughout the years, and throughout the year, not only in terms of the peak of the lean season, but really throughout the year. So we have a situation of chronic food insecurity and a situation of quasi-permanent state of malnutrition. Now, in terms of malnutrition, we know that malnutrition in the Sahel is present right from birth, and it peaks in the first year of age. And we know from studies that this is a very critical window. If children do not get the right micronutrients and the right food in their first 2 years of life, including from conception to the age of 2, they will be impaired mentally and physically for the rest of their life. So it's very important to also have interventions that really focus and tackle that specific window. Now, in terms of putting all of those elements together, so you have a crisis in resilience, you have the structural weaknesses, you have a state of chronic food insecurity, also a quasi-permanent state of malnutrition in the Sahel. Any small shocks can really have a very rapid and negative consequence in the region. And if we look at the situation now, as we enter 2012, several governments in the Sahel have declared the year, if you want, a year of crisis in terms of production and availability. If you look at the aggregate figures, yes, in terms of production, if compared to the 5 years production in terms of the countries and in the sales countries, the decrease has been small. But if we look at the per capita production in those countries, you look, for example, at Mauritania, there's been a decrease in per capita production of about 46% compared to the last 5 years average. 36% in Chad, 23% in Niger, 17% in Mali. So it's not just about the aggregate figure of production. And also, food security has become very complex in the region, and it's not only conditioned by production. And this year, what is very worrisome is that we have some very serious aggravating factors in the region. And these aggravating factors include, for example, the very high rates of malnutrition, which range from 10 to 15% throughout the region. In certain places, for example, in Chad, in many places in Chad, the rates are above 15%. In Niger, for example, in Tillabéri, we have rates which are above 15%. And that's very worrisome at this time of year that we have such high levels of malnutrition in the region. We also have a crisis in terms of increases in terms of cost of commodities. Basic commodities have started to rise even in harvest time, so even from October to December. For example, in Mali, there's been a very high rise of commodities. If you look at other places, for example, also in Niger, even in surplus producing areas, Maradi, Zinder, if you look at Chad, for example, in the Bol region, there's been very high increase in terms of cost of commodities, which leads to a sort of crisis of being able to access food by the population. On top of that, you had very short recovery since the last crisis, 2009, 2010. And you also have the pressure from the return of the migrant workers from Libya and from Côte d'Ivoire, where it's going to prevent households from receiving vital cash transfers during the lean season. And these are the aggravating factors that make the situation very worrisome this year. Now, in terms of response, we think that there is a need for a rapid scale-up to be able to prevent very high peaks of mortality in the next lean season, and also in terms of preventing a further deterioration of the nutritional situation in the Sahel. WFP has put together a range of preparedness and response strategies, and And these are very focused and very targeted, and targeted on the most vulnerable areas and on the most vulnerable population. And our approach is basically to a threefold approach, if you want. On one side, it's a very specific focus on nutrition, and on nutrition, two components, the treatment side and prevention side. Treatment side, WFP, as you know, is responsible for treatment of MAM, moderate acute malnutrition, working very closely with UNICEF for the treatment of SAM, severe acute malnutrition. And on the other side, what is very important is to put in place also interventions that, if you want, prevent malnutrition. So blanket supplementary feeding for all children under 2 and pregnant and lactating women will be also very important. So that's one part of the scale-up that WFP is putting forward. The other component is, as we were talking about resilience, is to put in place activities that increases the coping mechanisms and the resilience of the population. Food for work, cash for work, using cash in places where the markets function, where there's enough nutritious food on the market, and using food in places where there's not enough nutritious food on the market. And then a third component is using targeted general distribution. Usually general distribution in the Sahel is used in the peak of the lean season, so usually between July and September. And in this case, we will be using on a targeted basis. Now, in terms of Niger, we've started our scale-up back in November. Our scale-up initially was for 460,000 beneficiaries through cash forward and food for work. We are, as we speak now, increasing that to 600,000. So that's to build the resilience and coping strategies for the population as we go into the lean season. And in terms of blanket supplementary feeding, we are starting in the next few weeks blanket supplementary feeding in the Tillabéri region, which is the highest hit region of Niger, which has rates of malnutrition above 15%. And we will be rolling over to other areas blanket supplementary feeding by April. Now, in terms of Niger, in terms of the use of general food distribution, as I said, usually we use it between July and September. The vulnerability assessment, the latest vulnerability assessment just came out. I mean, the preliminary results just came out last week. And what it shows in Niger is that 1.9 million people are severely affected by food insecurity in the Sahel, and 4.2 million are moderately affected by food insecurity. And the number of severely affected by food insecurity will likely rise to 3.5 by April. Now, our initial scale-up for Niger was for 6 months, was from December to May. It was to cover 1.1 million beneficiaries. And now, with the results of vulnerability assessment, we will revise our strategy from post-May onwards until the end of the year. In terms of Mauritania and Chad, the governments came out with a response plan. So our response is in support to the government response plan. In Mauritania, we are planning to support 400,000. Here, let me also go into the other slides here. So these are the regions, I mean, most affected. I was talking about all the different conditions that we had in terms of resilience and so on and food insecurity. And then let me see here. So in terms of Mauritania, in terms of the scale-up for Mauritania, 400,000 people, and that's in complement to what the government will be doing, which is, I think, more or less about covering 400,000 people. And Mauritania is really facing a crisis of access to food, especially in the south. The price of basic commodities have risen sharply. And in Mauritania, let's not forget also that 75% of the commodities are usually imported. So any variations on the international market has a direct impact on the food security situation of the population in Mauritania. In terms of Mali, we've seen a very high rise of the basic commodities from October to November during the harvest season, which was very unusual. Yes, they've stabilized a bit since, but this is putting quite some pressure, especially in some areas which are also surplus producing areas in Mali. In terms of Chad, Chad, the government came out on the 21st of December to request international assistance, and we are working very closely with the Chad government to put in place our response as a support to the government strategy. Now, in terms of Chad, the rates of malnutrition are extremely high. In many places of Chad, they're above the 15% level, so it's quite a cause of concern at this time during the year before the lean season. And the lean season, obviously, is starting much earlier this year and will be much longer and harsher. In terms of looking, I mean, overall, and just to maybe finish on this point, in terms of the challenges, upcoming challenges, rapid scale-up will be absolutely critical. I mean, there's the semantics, is it a crisis, is it not a crisis? But I think the important thing is that if a rapid scale-up is not done timely with targeted intervention in terms of, on one side, nutrition, and on the other side, to try to strengthen the coping strategies and the resilience of the population, we may find ourselves in a major crisis in a few months from now. So it's a question of having the right scale-up, a question also to analyze the situation as we go. And even if this scale-up will be absolutely necessary, I think the real challenge really remains in terms of addressing resilience, longer-term resilience. And also in terms of addressing the structural causes of food insecurity in the Sahel and the structural causes of this quasi-permanent state of malnutrition in the Sahel. And I think this will really take a longer-term commitment from the governments, the different governments in the Sahel, but also from the international community to put in place activities and comprehensive longer-term activities also that support, if you want, to be able to break that cycle of hunger and malnutrition and food insecurity in the Sahel. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this microphone on? Can everybody hear? Yes, okay. Let me now turn to Benjamin Safari, who, again, my thanks for participating on Skype. Then we've talked about a limit roughly of 10 to 12 minutes so we can get enough discussion and you can participate in it because this is an experts audience here. So why don't you go ahead? Okay. I guess it's good morning to you. It's good morning to me as well, I think. Well, it's 2:30. Excuse me. It's about 2:33 a.m. here, so I apologize ahead of time if I stumble on one thing or another. I'm just going to go straight to what I see as the current situation in West Africa, just to get going. I think the speaker from WFP summarized it very well, so he saved me a lot of time. But just to mention that in terms of the security, the security and socio-political situation, there are about 100,000 returnees from Libya in Niger. And so those will have a big impact on the food security in Niger because that's a lot of money that Niger was receiving from their work in Libya that they won't be receiving anymore, but it's also extra mouths to feed. Nigeria currently has a big problem with the Boko Haram sect. Ivory Coast is slowly recovering from the post-Gbagbo war. And as we all know, there is a security situation with within the Sahara Belt with the Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb and other people causing trouble there. So those are some of the surrounding factors to the food security in the Sahelian countries. In terms of food security, just to get a picture, very, very simple and more or less straightforward, you have a situation where 80%, 90% of the population in Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad depend on rain-fed agriculture. And this rain-fed agriculture basically is a one season of planting per year, and it goes from July to September, which is only 3 months, and it comes with variable rainfall that starts on
different dates and different times, especially this year, where in 2011 the rain started late and ended up early. In Niger, in particular, the analysis we received a couple of months ago suggested that about 520,000 metric tons of were expected and never showed up. So there's a 14% deficit on the production side. And the hardest hit area is a small area called Tilaberi, which accounts for about 1/3 of total deficit. In Mali, the yields were reduced by up to 40% nationwide. And the system of early warning expects that there will be a food crisis in approximately 104 communes out of the whole country. The crisis seems to be concentrated in the northwest Mopti region and in the northern Kais region of Mali. In Burkina Faso, we have a situation where approximately 40% of the communes are characterized as at risk of severe poverty in 2012. That's 146 communes out of 352. So that's pretty much the general picture without going into the details of the situation. What can we do? What have we done so far, and what can we do to address the situation? I guess that's what we're discussing here. Before I go into what we can do, I just want to tell you a couple of stories, and these stories basically advocate for using local markets to intervene, both to save lives and to also sustain livelihoods. Most of you would know an economist by the name of Amartya Sen. In 1981, he published an essay called Poverty and Famines on Entitlement and Deprivation. And that basically was a demonstration that whenever there is a famine, it's not necessarily that there is no food. It's that the poorest people can no longer afford to access the food with their own means. The second story comes from CRS. I happen to be from Rwanda by birth. And those of you who know a little bit the history of Rwanda know that in '94 there was a severe crisis. There was a genocide and a war, and farmers pretty much lost a season of agriculture. And it was generally thought that when farmers lose their seeds, what you do is buy seeds and bring them seeds and distribute them freely to the farmers, and everything will be okay thereafter. CIAT conducted a study that found actually that what the farmers lose is not necessarily seeds. It's the financial means to access the seeds. The seeds may be there, but they don't have the money to access the seeds anymore. So we picked up from the study of CIAT back in the 90s, and we had our first experience as CRS with using seed vouchers and fairs in Uganda in 2000. And since 2000, CRS has been using vouchers and local markets as much as possible to address problems of food insecurity mostly, but also other problems, including sanitation, health, seeds, agricultural issues especially. So basically this is just a some advocacy on behalf of CRS for looking at markets and realizing that markets work most of the time. In our experience, and here I'm going to, I think I have 4 key messages to share. The first one is that markets are always often integrated, and they are efficient in responding to signals. So you find that no matter how much there is a crisis, markets will respond to demand, provided communication infrastructures are operational, and the distribution of local or regional production, especially through local procurement, when done well and to the right scale, can have a long-term benefit to local farmers and traders. The second message, just briefly, is that local purchase, especially with vouchers of goods that could be produced locally or regionally, is really effective. the key is that locally empowered local recipients can use their own common sense to choose what they want and what they need. And we find that they are effective because they are faster, and they're often cheaper and preferred to. And when you're providing food, local procurement of food, of local or regional produced food, is preferred to food that's imported from far away. My third message is that, having lived in the Sahel for the past 10 years, having observed how everyday life operates in the Sahel, I think Sahelians are very resilient, and they have well-established coping mechanisms. They are used. I probably shouldn't use the term used, but they know about food crisis, and they have well-established coping mechanisms. But often I find, often these don't last very long. So when there is a continuous or a repeated number of crises over time, the coping mechanisms tend to erode, and they tend to also erode the assets that would be used to regenerate their coping mechanism. So external assistance is needed, but it's often needed for 10, 20%, and it's often for a short-term duration. But, and this is my last message before I close. Food crises are recurrent in the Sahel. And we are noticing that they are exacerbating with, pressure on land, heavy population growth, environmental degradation. So we can discuss about fixing the problems of today, but I think there is a big debate that we are still lacking in terms of how we can fix tomorrow's problems today. I think we need to encourage donors, especially the U.S. government, since we are here. We need to encourage the U.S. government to really have a very long-term vision of agricultural sustainability problems, and have increased flexibility in its programming, in its assistance. That's my message for today. We have several options to address the current crisis, but from my experience, I think using markets and using especially vouchers-based, which are semi-restricted currencies for people to use to purchase what they need, I found that using vouchers is a very good, very efficient option when used at the right scale and for the right duration of time. Thank you.
Ben, thank you. That was very insightful. I do think you raised the question which we ought to address in the discussion. That is that this is not a new problem. The world did not discover the Sahel yesterday. And as people in this room know, because they were involved in it, goes back at least in the 1970s and traditionally even before that. Question, therefore, is for the outside community is how much was not done or not done for the long-term institutions and policies that would at least buffer the impact of what will probably be inevitable droughts, and why haven't we done it before? Let me turn to Mira Shekhar, who tore herself away from a meeting at the World Bank to come and talk about nutrition, for which we're very grateful, because she's the lead health specialist in the Africa region, technical health unit, and she is an expert on all of these issues.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you very much for that welcome. I'm not sure I'm as much of an expert as you make me out to me, but thank you. Apologies also for not being able to make it this morning. I was pulled to something else, but I am here now, and I did hear some part of the conversation towards the end of the last panel. And it was very interesting to see the kinds of questions. I'm going to try and address some of the questions that arose, but perhaps most I will not address in this session, maybe in the conversation later. So you've heard from two speakers, even on this panel, about how this crisis, that we're calling it a crisis in the Sahel region, is not something that started to happen yesterday or last month or in the last few months or years. It's something that's been there for a very long time. So my focus will really be on what I would call more of a chronic emergency that exists in the region. And Michelle specifically asked me to talk about the nutrition issues, so that's what I'll try and focus on. So if you look at pre-existing child malnutrition rates in these countries, look at a country like Mali. Almost 40% of the children in Mali are stunted. Stunted meaning being short for their height. Look at Mauritania, more than 30% stunted. These are in the good years. This is not when the crisis hits. This is the standard situation in these countries. And stunting means being short for your height, just like I am. Stunted people have lower human capital, less cognitive function, less ability to earn and produce things. So think about countries that have high numbers of stunted children. What are we doing? What are we setting these countries up for in the future? So think about it in that context. Same thing, if you look at the next slide, look at Niger. Mali looks good in comparison to Niger, with nearly 50% of the children being stunted on a regular basis. If you look at the GNI per capita, Niger is not so bad. So it's not just a wealth issue. It is an income issue, but it's not just an income issue. There are other issues as well. And there are other countries that have higher, lower GNI, but higher rates of malnutrition, stunting in particular in this case. I also wanted to show you, just from one country, the trends over time. So this is Niger. The dark bars over here are rates of stunting. The lighter bars over here are rates of underweight. This is 1985, 91, 92, 2000, 2008. Do you see a trend here? Flat. Not much change over time. So this is a chronic problem. It's not something that started to happen today. It continues. And if you look at what the Millennium Development Goals were for Niger or for any of the other countries in the Sahel region, this is what the goal was, to reduce those rates from where they are, 40% and above, to 20%. We're nowhere near those goals. And the crises that we are seeing are certainly contributing to those, but they're not the only reason this is happening. The other thing worth looking at on the data, again, I've only picked two countries, Mali and Niger, is that if you disaggregate the data by income quintiles, these are the poorest children in Mali, and these are the richest children in Mali. So you see that the poorest children, nearly 40%, are stunted. But look at the richest children. Nearly 20% are stunted there as well. Again, I go back to this thing. It is a poverty issue, for sure, but it's not just a poverty issue. And I think it's important to appreciate that. In the case of Niger, it's even more pronounced. Nearly 40% of the kids in the richest income quintile are stunted. One other facet of malnutrition that we see in the Sahel countries, vitamin A deficiency and deficiency of iron leading to anemia. In the case of vitamin A deficiency, nearly 60% children in Mali vitamin A deficient. Similar numbers, slightly higher numbers in Niger. In the case of anemia, more than 80% in Niger, in Mali, and the same in Niger. So think about it. if a child is vitamin A deficient, this child is 23% more likely to die. What are we setting these children up for? Solutions are relatively simple. If a child is anemic, he or she is much more likely to have lower cognitive function, have lower productivity. What are we setting these countries up for in terms of future? Same thing with anemia among women. Nearly 70% anemia in women in both the countries. Anemic women are more likely to die during childbirth. So again, huge consequences. And this is just the background. This is just the chronic situation in these countries. Superimpose on that the crises that all of you have been talking about. I won't go into any detail on the crises and the numbers and so on and so forth, because I believe you've spent a fair amount of time talking about those things. But just want to emphasize the fact that there is a crisis that is starting to happen on top of that. The challenge with the crisis is, again, as has been said earlier, that we don't quite know what the exact numbers are, what they should be. But does that really matter? Because you know there's a chronic problem that is so acute. So I won't go into these numbers or these details, but these are some of the numbers that are sloshing around. We do know that there is some sort of a crisis in the making. Don't know the exact size of that. We've had 2 bank missions. I think my colleague Gail was here earlier. I'm not sure if he's still here. But he was one of the people from the World Bank who went to the countries to do these analyses. Again, I won't dwell on those, but simply to say in at least 2 of the countries, Mali and Mauritania, we've had fairly intensive analysis done. And there are appeals coming from the government as well. The colleague from WFP spoke about the number of cases of severe acute malnutrition. As the crisis becomes more prevalent, more severe, we expect the numbers of children with severe acute malnutrition to increase. And the size of the bubbles here suggests how many cases one is anticipating. I won't go into details, but just give you a visual for what is expected. Now, all of these are numbers that are slightly soft because of the way they're coming in. But I want to go back now to children. We know that children are the most important human capital for these countries. If we don't invest in them today, as I said earlier, 20, 30 years later, these children are not going to be able to drive the economies in these countries. If we look at the determinants of child malnutrition, we usually talk about, I would like you to think only at this level at the moment, access to food, childcare practices, water, sanitation, health, and care to be the most important thing. These are the underlying causes. So food, health, and care are the 3 underlying causes for child malnutrition. In most situations, we go into countries and we say, okay, what is the limiting factor here? Is it food? Is it health? Is it care? So what should we intervene in? Now, in the case of Sahel and most of the countries in that region, unfortunately, what we're finding is all 3 are constrained. So acting on only one of these will not do it. Acting on each of those is absolutely essential. Food, health, and care, all 3 are necessary. Not one of them is sufficient in itself. Think about a child with diarrhea. You can feed him or her as much as you like. What's going to happen to this child? Is not likely to survive. So I present this in terms of thinking about solutions for the crises. That we need to think about the food-related solutions, but also maternal and child care solutions, empowering mothers so that they can access services and access resources, and also ensuring that we have supply side in terms of water and sanitation health services. Several of you talked about that earlier. But we've also talked about why this crisis keeps recurring. And it keeps recurring because we don't necessarily address the basic causes of this problem. And those basic causes lie in the institutions, the institutional capacities that Eric Munoz referred to earlier, political frameworks within the countries and within the region, the economic structure, but also environment. Several of you talked about climate change, and so on and so forth. So if we're looking for a longer-term solution, we certainly need to address the shorter-term issues, but we cannot forget the underlying and the basic causes as well in trying to define the solutions. So within the bank, we're talking about addressing through some of the immediate causes through the usual infant and young child nutrition projects and programs which look at both prevention and treatment, micronutrient supplementation and fortification to address those sorts of issues, but also agriculture, food security, social protection, gender issues over the medium term. And then in the longer term, governance, stewardship, capacities for management, trade, all of those issues need to be addressed. I'm going to stop very soon. I'm not going to dwell on this slide on the root causes. I think you've heard all these terms multiple times by now. Just to say that it's not just one thing, but a multitude of things that need to be looked at. So in terms of next steps, we do not have a plan as yet, but something that is emerging. And the idea would be that it needs to, whatever response emerges has to be a three-phased response, a rapid response that sort of addresses within the first 6 months the emergency issues. And we learned this experience from the Horn of Africa experience, addressing the emergency nutrition and health issues, building safety net systems. Countries that had safety net systems in place were able to scale up those programs much better than countries that didn't have any this thing. And then over a 6-month to 2-year period, working with the governments to develop an economic recovery program that addresses livelihood issues, crop and livestock production, strengthening health and nutrition services over the longer period, addressing market failures. You have the whole list over here. I won't read it out, but also not to forget that we all need to get another medium and perhaps even much more longer term than the 2 to 5 year perspective in place, so that whatever we build in the first 2 phases, we can sustain that over time. The last comment, sort of takeaway message, is that as we develop these various responses, we need to think about using potential. In the past, we've just used hunger as the vulnerability indicator. What we are recognizing is that if we use an indicator that has a longer-term perspective, then our responses are also geared towards that longer-term perspective. So using nutrition security as an indicator of vulnerability, that might be something that also helps us make the jump from this knee-jerk humanitarian response to a longer-term response. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
That was excellent. Is that available anywhere on a website, your website?
What?
PowerPoint?
I guess we could make it available. We don't have it on our website.
Okay. You are? Okay, good. You're way ahead of me, as usual. Let me then turn to our final speaker, Gregory Gottlieb, who's the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for AIDS Bureau of Food Security.
Can I sit right here?
You can.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear okay? No? Okay. Just pull it
I'm not
close.
speaking yet. So,
Just pull it closer to you.
all right, thanks. I'll pull it closer. So I have the pleasure. I don't have to comment directly on the Sahel and the situation. I think you've gotten a pretty comprehensive view of it. I'm looking at the opportunities and challenges of trying to integrate relief and development. There's been a lot of talk. I've heard a number of speakers talk about what we used to do in the past, and I am a little bit historical in that sense, since I started my career back in 1981. So a lot of the problems that I see today are ones that I saw when I first started to do this work. So it kind of gives me, I think I can say that I've got a little bit of a perspective on this, and I can say I think that there are some things that certainly we have to do better and there are certainly things that we have made progress on over the years. So if I can just look back just briefly, and noting the clock to try to make enough time, I think, for questions and answers. I think in the many early years of relief, comparing it to development, it was a very stovepiped kind of response. Emergency was emergency, development was a development. Oftentimes the two sides didn't talk together. What the development people thought was important were oftentimes not what the relief people thought was important, or even matched up with what relief people had been working on. And I think this became evident to me when I worked out in East Africa, and I was in charge of Africa for OFDA. Part of it was as Burundi began to recover from its long civil war, we had such a divide between what the development people thought needed to be done and all the work that had been done over many years by emergency people that you could see was verging on development type work. And I think that's where we've begun to make a lot of our changes. We've begun to see that a lot of the work that we do now on the emergency side, because we stay there so long, really is just a development program in another guise. And so the challenge for us is how do we get our development programs and our relief programs to work together in a really integrated way. And I'll get to that just in terms of what we're doing in USAID recently. So let me just talk about a little bit of the evolution of it as I saw it. I mentioned Burundi. I think we're beginning to see our colleague from Australia, Ben, talked about the seed fairs. We could see the beginnings of trying to use a market-based approach to doing relief. We realized that we had wrong assumptions about what happened in communities. People talk about knee-jerk responses. Seeds and tools was probably one of the most common knee-jerk responses until we got some really good and very interesting work out of CRS. And I think it's changed the way that we've approached it. If you advance from when we did that work in Rwanda to now, if you look at Somalia, a lot of the work, a lot of the access work in Somalia is done with vouchers. Security reasons is one, but two, we recognize that there's an efficiency there. So I think you can begin to see where the emergency people taking a play out of the playbook of the development side by trying to use markets to our advantage. And also emergency people understanding that even when you have an emergency, you don't have a failure of every system. Markets still function. We have the quote from Sen. Absolutely, markets still function. They just function for some and not all. So I think what we see with a lot of our emergency work is the understanding of that. So whether it's vouchers, whether it's cash, now whether it's insurance, that's another thing that's come up where right now part of what we're doing in our program in Kenya, Feed the Future program, is a look at insurance for pastoralists. It's a small program, it's a pilot program, but in fact we've seen this before. I think Mike Hess was here, but I know back in 2007, 2008 we started doing insurance work in Ethiopia as a response to drought and rising prices, not necessarily as a development tool. So I think there's a lot of things that are coming together that way. The recent report out by Oxfam and Save the Children, which was a critique of the actions in the Horn, I thought laid out a few things that were and are good things that are happening within USAID. They specifically cite some of the works that we're doing with the crisis modifier. Those of you that were in aid 15, 16 years ago know that, in fact, aid brought forward a crisis modifier for missions to use, but it was used very little. And in part, it wasn't used because it didn't really fit with the development model. There was a reluctance, a conservatism around many of our development colleagues to really use it. I think what we're seeing in Ethiopia is a great example of how you can do that, where you can structure a development program that uses emergency money to help modify itself as a disaster comes. And so what we're trying to do in the Horn right now to take advantage of this kind of thing is we created what we called just a joint planning cell. You could have called it anything. It doesn't really matter. But the point is, at the table in Nairobi and in Addis are our development and our relief people. They sit together. Right now what they're doing is they're designing the transition programs, because we had a slide up here about 3 stages of the responding on the emergency. They're designing that transition program, which is what OFTA and our emergency Food for Peace people will do. And the development people are now designing their programs to carry on for those. That was an opportunity that we missed so often, the ability to have something at the back end as your emergency money came to an end. And also the point we missed was that it really was those communities that we should have been targeting. They were the most vulnerable. Instead, a lot of our development money went elsewhere. So I think we're finally finding our feet a little bit out in the Horn, and I think it's a really productive change. And it is one that can be applied to the Sahel as well. I've got a couple other things that I want to just point out that I hope will stimulate a little conversation, and then I'll conclude. One, I think one of the challenges is coordination. Broad coordination across all agencies. I had the opportunity, I was in Haiti after the earthquake, working, my job was to coordinate with the UN and the civil society. There are many words and many languages to describe that, what happened. Essentially, though, we had probably the exclusion of 2/3 of all the groups that were there in Haiti who didn't participate in any kind of coordination. So clearly it's a challenge for us. I think a lot of the things that we've done in the cluster system are good for us. I think we have a ways to go to make that integration a lot better. We also, I think, have a rising problem here, a challenge in the Sahel compared to the Horn. I will compliment Fuse on the work they did in the Horn, not simply because I used to be with Fuse, but because, and Oxfam and SAVE said they did a great job, but the fact is what we had was widespread acknowledgement, acceptance of the evidence that was produced. We don't quite have that in the Sahel. So clearly for us, one of the challenges is the information that's available to us and how we analyze it. And how do we develop a system that more quickly analyzes and comes to agreement on the information that's available to us. Early warning, again, I'm historical here. I've been around it a long time. It's improved a lot. It can improve more, but it's the use of that so that we can get quick action, because the failing, as the Oxfam UK and SAVE report shows out, is that it's a matter of early response. So I think we can do a lot better on that. Finally, just to conclude, I think our John Shikatana had a very good statement. I think he talked about rational allocation. And I think that is one of the challenges that faces us between our emergency side and our development side. What really are we doing with our money? Where are we citing it? Where are we putting it? And are we addressing the populations in the way that we think will really get to some of these huge challenges that we look at on the nutrition side? And finally, there are still funding challenges. There are still stovepipes around money. And we do have to grow more flexible in the way that we look at both of those accounts. I'm not saying that there aren't core competencies. Our colleagues from the Hill are here, so I'm mindful of that. There are times when you really do need emergency money, and you need a lot of it, and Haiti is one of those examples. So you can't diminish what happens because regarding complex emergencies and forget about the needs that in natural disasters that are substantial and growing because of growing populations and changes in climate. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Well, I want to compliment the panel for extraordinarily interesting and concise presentations, and that leaves open a lot of questions. We have a number of our colleagues in the overflow room, and I'd ask you who are in the overflow room, we've got one of our Wilson's and her colleagues, who, if you'll write down your questions, we will. I will frame them here for the audience here, so please write them down, pass them up, and we'll try and respond to them. Similarly, questions and very pithy and short observations would be requested because time is of the essence, and I want to get as many people as I can to make their point. So we'll open up the floor, and there's a hand way up in the back on my left-hand side. You want to identify yourself and speak into the microphone so everybody hears you.
Yes, hi. My name is Lamari Navarrete. I'm an editor for LaRouchePack.com. And I've heard a lot here about plans for the short to the medium term. One of the things I was wondering about is what idea of a contingency plan is there for the collapse of the transatlantic system when it comes to Africa? Because everyone's thinking about this. And Africa doesn't have much of a chance with the way the economy is currently going globally. Second of all, we just put out a policy paper called Planetary Defense and Extraterrestrial Imperative, in which one of the things we address is how do you confront the global collapse from the standpoint of transforming our address of problems such as food crisis, not from a regional standpoint, but from a global standpoint, because that's what we're dealing with right here when we're talking about a transatlantic collapse, going from regional to globally addressing these crises. One of the things we discuss is transformation of the weather. And you may be familiar with a project called TransAqua, which was proposed in the 70s by Marcello Vicchi, he's still alive, he's a Italian engineer. And he proposed the idea of replenishment of Lake Chad to resolve the food insufficiencies in the region, essentially greening the desert. So I'm curious, I'm provoking your imagination, and I want to know what kinds of discussions and is this being discussed or even thought about?
Okay, that's great. Gentleman here with his program up.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Qasim, and I actually come from a peasant family in Africa. I have farmed in Africa. Anybody here do the same thing? And what my concern is, I work for the World Bank and AID since 1969. My first boss was David Shearer. He has better hair than I do. I've spent my life at rural development and poverty alleviation, and I've worked from Senegal to Somalia. And one of the things I'm rather upset with here is this total focus on the public sector. Every one of those countries is ruled and misruled by a bunch of gangsters. Mobutu wasn't the only one, you know. So what you get is that if you've got restriction on trade, it's extortion. The boss man and his family extort from everybody else. So all these considerations that you give out without consideration of the political factor is value subtracting.
Okay, that's good. That's a very important question. Let me take one more, and then we'll turn to the panel for short responses. They can pick anything they want, and we'll go from there. Right here in the front.
Hi, I'm Michelle Lerner with Bread for the World Institute. I think a lot of this discussion has been very valuable, but I'm troubled by the lack of a gender analysis on some of this. I've had colleagues report that boys are much more prevalent in the feeding centers. You don't really see adult men dying of starvation. You see the women, even nursing mothers, eating last, which has a huge consequence for the children in the 1,000 days opportunity window. So I was just wondering if you all had anything to add on what is being done or how you see that impacting the problem.
Good. You've got three very interesting points, one of which is, if I have it correctly, what happens if the financial system implodes even more than it has already, and still in very fragile situation. The politics of development, which are critical, and the issue of gender sensibility. And just let me go in reverse, and we'll.
Thanks. Well, I'll go to the.
Earn your fee.
Thank you. I'll go to the first question first. You know what Mark Twain said, don't you? about the weather. Everybody talks about it. Nobody does anything about it. So I can't really speak to the weather, but what I can speak to on that is I think pointing out what happened at L'Aquila, where donors came together to look at food security as a real global problem. It's a $22 billion pledge by all donors. And I don't think that, I think from what we can tell so far, many donors are on track to meet those pledges over a 3-year period. The point there is that from when you look at the oil spikes and the price spikes in food back in 2007, 2008, from then, USAID's investment, and I can speak for aid, it was the lowest point of our investment in agriculture back in 2008 in the budget. But the President's initiative, Feed the Future, I think represents the U.S. government, a real recommitment by the U.S. government to agriculture and food security. And it's the same for many other donors who are contributing substantial amounts. Ours is $3.5 billion over 3 years. The Japanese is $3 billion over 3 years. I think that's the acknowledgement that people recognize food security as a global problem. So that's the positive part. I think that's the good part. If transatlantic, if things collapse and the world economy collapses, everybody will be affected. So it's not going to, it won't touch just Europe. So yes, definitely a difficult issue. In terms of extortion, misrule, or shall we can put it more kindly, governance issues. Yes, I mean, those are other, I can say those are other components of the USAID programs, but I do think that one of the things we're trying to do in a lot of our trade programs is to look at those border crossings in particular to see if you can't simplify those. I know we've had some successes in Southern Africa, which is perhaps less plagued by extortion issues. We do know how bad it is in West Africa. We've met with many of our counterparts there. I don't think anybody wants to sweep it under the table. I think one of the ways we're trying to deal with it is to sort of simplify those systems so it just makes it harder for people to cheat at that level. So that's a short way of saying that. And in terms of your issue on gender, I think my colleague over here would be in a better position, but I can say that I think there's a couple good initiatives out there that recognize the issues are there. SUN is one, scaling up nutrition, and Secretary Clinton's effort through 1,000 days, which really supports SUN. I don't think anybody, that's another issue, nobody's wants to sweep that under the table, and I think under the Secretary, she has been very, very, very concerned about this, and I know it's a real component of what we're doing, and even in a lot of our ag funding, in fact, we've gone with programs that support, directly support women agriculturalists, but it doesn't get to your issue of what's happening in a feeding center, so I'm going to turn it to my colleague.
Mira, let me turn to you, and then Ben, you may want to add into this, so I'll give you the microphone, which you have already, after Mira talks.
Thank you. Couple of things. First, on the global economy. You know, if the global economy crashes, I think it's more than food security that will suffer. We have a lot more things to worry about. So let's just put things in perspective there. As Greg said already, there's been a lot of conversations in the G8 and the G20 around the food crisis and food security. And certainly AID has scaled up its investments from the bank side, where some years ago we had really minimized our investments in agriculture. Those have come back with the bank. And if I remember, I worry about giving these numbers, but if I remember correctly, we have something of the order of $6 billion invested in 2010 in agriculture and rural development. That's a big comeback from the past. Same thing, social protection programs have come back big time, primarily in response to this. The other thing that's thinking within the bank is to help countries even where there isn't a crisis at the moment. One of the lessons we've learned is that the countries that had systems in place could scale these up, these social protection programs, very quickly. So putting those systems in place, even in countries where there isn't a crisis, has become a priority from the bank's side. So those are some of the issues we're trying to address in hopefully not having to deal with the transatlantic crash that you referred to. There's also a high-level task force on food security led by the UN Secretary General himself that all of the agencies participate in, and the idea is to try and coordinate our actions on that. Governance is certainly perhaps one of the most important issues that is discussed at the bank on a regular basis. The bank's Africa strategy in particular, the primary underlying theme of the whole strategy is governance. So it's not just, again, for food security, but for everything across the board. Governance and corruption issues are foremost in the design of all programs and projects and support. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that we are engaging only with the public sector. The bank in particular is trying to engage quite heavily with the, certainly with CSOs, particularly in helping with governance issues, but also to some extent with the private sector as well. So I wouldn't buy the statement that somebody made that the development community is focusing primarily on the public sector. That is not the case. On the gender analysis, you're right. We know that in any crisis, women and children, those are the ones that suffer the most. And if we think about the 1,000 days window of opportunity, if we let that happen, we've lost it. We've lost not just those children, we've lost a whole generation and their ability to contribute to productivity in their countries. So the SUN initiative that Greg referred to, the Scaling Up Nutrition initiative that was actually, we thought was a dream at one time, has now become quite a reality, is focusing on those sorts of things. I do have to say that many of the countries in the Sahel are not necessarily fully engaged in the SUN as yet, but that would be our effort in the medium term.
Mary, can I ask you, we've got a question from the overflow room, which I don't want to not get on the table. He asks, what are the cultural factors driving the high prevalence of stunting and anemia in Mali and Niger, if not just poverty itself?
Well, we could have a 1-hour session on that. But essentially, many of those cultural factors link to the gender issues that we just spoke about. When food is available, it's not necessarily prioritized for the most vulnerable. That's certainly one whole set of issues there. There are issues around erosion of traditional practices that in the past kept these children well nourished. Breastfeeding, for example, being one classic one. In the past, most women would breastfeed their children. Now, with all the wonders of globalization and modernization, that isn't necessarily fashionable anymore, and that's unfortunately starting to happen in many parts of Africa and South Asia and many other regions as well. So there's a whole bunch of issues, but the most important thing is that lack of focus on those 1,000 days when we can really have an impact is what is driving the high rates of stunting. And in the past, there was some thinking that we could go in and feed these children after. Well, after the age of 2, you can feed a child. Feed me after the age of 2. I won't grow in this direction. I won't grow in this direction. I will grow in this direction. That's not something you want me to do. So too little, too late, too expensive after the age of 2.
Okay, that's great. Ben, do you want to add in on this?
Just a couple of things, briefly. One is about the issue of corruption and governance, and here I want to point out that there are some good examples of countries that have significantly reduced corruption, and I want to brag about Rwanda. There may be other issues, but in some places, with the right policies and the right control systems, you can resolve those problems. As an NGO or as a PVO, CRS has limited capacity to have influence in the area of public administration or governance at a national level. But we do governance work at the community level, and when it starts at the bottom, it raises up eventually to the public sector and to the national level. So I think it's not. I think it's not a lost cause, and I think together with bilateral donors and multilateral organizations, we are doing combined work to try and improve governance. There's also the fact that now with communications, with the availability of information at all levels, it's getting harder and harder to corner someone into paying some things without, the risk of it being known. So there is hope, and we're trying the best we can to address those issues. And I don't want to, say what other people have said, but for example, with the question on sun and 1,000 days. It's a new vibe. It's a new word out in development, and everybody is busy trying to focus on children under 2 and pregnant mothers. And so we are really trying hard. But here we're talking about a crisis in the Sahel, and unfortunately, when you're focusing on one issue, you try to zoom in on the most significant factors. And some of the questions, I think, are looking at bigger picture issues that we are addressing in other areas, but that you cannot necessarily address within the framework of a specific food security crisis in a specific area. I don't think, for example, that if we're talking about addressing the food crisis now, that we can, at the same time, hope to address cultural issues that have been changed over the long term. I don't think that we can hope to address, with a response to this crisis, we can hope to significantly address questions of environmental degradation, for example. But, and this is what I said in the last statement of my presentation briefly, I think there needs to be, at the same time as we look at the crisis now, we need to think about solving tomorrow's problems today, or starting to solve them today. So today's crisis shouldn't make us lose focus on the bigger picture issues that are very relevant, but very long-term and very complex to address. Thanks.
Okay, that's very good. Jacques, can you take a brief intervention in your response to all of this? I apologize to those who are not going to get to ask questions. The management of this meeting are being very rigorous, and we have yet a summing up coming from Emmy Simmons. And at 12:15, the webcast goes down. Is that right? Okay, so we want to end by that, but I hope some of the panelists will be available to talk with you in the interim. Jacques?
Okay, so very, very quickly. On the point, I think there's been a big shift in terms of the approach also to food security, as Greg and Mira was saying, in terms of the commitment to food security. But like L'Aquila, for example, was a commitment to agricultural development, which is very important. But at the same time, it was a realization that nutrition was also very important, and safety nets also were very important in the strategy of agricultural development. So I think there's been a major shift on that level. There's been a major shift also on the nutrition level. We've mentioned the SUN framework, the 1,000 Days Initiative. So I think there's been a major shift. So we are, I think, moving in the right direction. In terms of gender, very quickly, I think it's a very important point. And in terms of WFP, we do put a lot of emphasis on gender. Like, for example, many of our interventions, we have different types of interventions. For example, school feeding has a very specific component on women, on gender, because we know that if we educate girls from a very early age, they are the one who are the central level to control food security in a household. So it's absolutely very important. And as they grow older, girls will become women. They will get married, and then they can also do some more informed choices in terms of the size of the family, in terms of what is important, the priorities of the family. So I think gender analysis is also always very important, not only in development context, but also in transition and emergencies. Thank you.
Okay, good. I'm going to turn the meeting over to Emmy Simmons, who many of you know as a longtime distinguished senior official of AID, who is now a board member of the Partnership to Cut Hunger and Poverty in Africa, to say what she wants to say and to summarize the meeting. You will find this very useful. I will say that one word has not emerged from any of this, which I think still remains very relevant, and that's infrastructure. If the bank and its other departments and other multilateral development institutions don't start seriously thinking about how Africa's infrastructure is improved, we'll face this problem again and again.
Thank you. Thank you, John. That was actually on my list, so I'm glad you brought it up. It's something that should
I
be
learned it all from you.
I'm here, I think, as a long-term Sahelian hand, having lived in Mali from 1982 to 1987, during which time there was a similar crisis, but again, a crisis against a backdrop of chronic poverty and of chronic undernutrition. So someone here has said something about, this is not a new problem in the Sahel, and, why is this time different from all other times? And I think that's what I want to point out today, because, in fact, I think the analysis that we've heard from our various speakers today, the kinds of suggestions that they've made with regard to use of tools, there are innovations, there are new ways of thinking, and building on Greg's last comments, there are new ways of acting as well, and I think Mira is as well. So I just want to kind of summarize what we've heard, just to make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page here, because I think the situation of crisis does focus the mind, and the potential for crisis focuses the minds, and I think we've had excellent focus in the discussions as well. But the reality I think that we all need to understand is, that, again, in the Sahel, is that the potential for crisis right now is against this very deeply deep chronic poverty and undernutrition. And so I think the question that many of us have raised that perhaps wasn't addressed quite as clearly, although John's stats kind of hinted at it, is in fact the sort of chronic backdrop changing? Is there a potential that crises are going to occur more frequently? And should that give us a sort of cause for urgency of action? And perhaps, going back to your last point, a cause for more expansive action. I think people have kind of presented sort of 4 ways of kind of analyzing and thinking about the potential for crisis, the impending crisis, or the potential for a more broad and far-reaching crisis in kind of 4 ways. What type of crisis are we facing? Is it an availability crisis, an access crisis? Is it a irreversible loss of assets crisis? Is it a partial failure of certain factors? Is it a total failure across the region? A second question is, for whom is this crisis going to be a crisis? I think we've had some indications from our FuseNet colleagues that we have a granularity of analysis in this particular era that we did not have back in 1984 when I was looking at crisis in the Sahel. It's obviously based upon geospatial analysis, but data has also been presented at a household level, looking at DHS and some of the specific measurements that have been made of child undernutrition. And I was happy to note that Mira also used some income analysis to show what income groups, in fact, might be facing crisis. And she, I thought, noted very helpfully that it's not just poverty. It's not just the kids of the poor who may be affected, but it's also some of the kids of the higher quintiles. I think we've also had a helpful reminder that within households, that it will be within households and within communities and within specific geographies, but within the households, it may also be a question of gender. And I think that's an important reminder. A third question that folks have put on the table is, if there is a crisis brewing, and I think there's pretty much agreement that it's brewing, the question is, can it be prevented this year? Can Anderson Cooper receive a telephone call and say, don't buy your tickets, it's brewing, but we've got the pot under control? And I think here, the part of this story that I heard from the various speakers had to do with the fact that this year, unlike '84, which is my baseline, there is a much wider range of tools to actually address and prevent and mitigate the emergence of crisis. John Statz talked about markets. People have talked about use of vouchers, cash assistance, food for work, cash for work, RUTFs, different kinds of food, purchases in, no one used the, where's our WFP called? Nobody used P for P, that purchasing in specific purchases by World Food Program in surplus areas and transport to deficit areas and deficit households. But that, again, is another tool. A fourth kind of sort of issue that people, I think, have addressed and specifically put on the table with regard to addressing a brewing crisis is really focusing on managing the worst impacts, recognizing that there is a potential for irreversible loss of assets, that there's a potential for irreversible child mortality and morbidity, and irreversible impact on children under 2. And I think various of the speakers emphasized the question of targeting. And again, this goes back to having better information, geospatial information, income information, having tools which people did not mention, having information, IT technologies, being able to use crowdsourcing, being able to use remote indications of impending crises. Back in 1984, it took people going out to villages and actually talking to people. Villagers now should be able to call in and sort of report on what their situation is. In 1984, when the pounding pestles, mortars and pestles, went silent, visitors quickly noted that there was no food in the village because there was nothing to cook. But these days, with IT, with instant communication, there should be, and I hope there is not, any need for to not know about that worst impact emerging. But I actually wanted to spend just a couple of minutes really underscoring what I think is perhaps not the L'Aquila challenge, but the World Food Summit of late 2009 challenge, Rome Principle number 3. People call me very wonky for using that phrase, but I think it is one of the most important Rome principles, and that is that the world community agreed that it was critical to address the immediate issues of undernutrition and malnutrition, while at the same time addressing the underlying causes of that undernutrition and malnutrition. And so I think that that principle and the world agreement on that principle was kind of underscored by Greg when he said that the humanitarian community and the development community for a very long time have kind of operated in stovepipes. And I gradually see, and this is part of my old age, I gradually see at least an effort being made to bring those two communities into a common framework and a common set of purposes. But this is really critical if we, in fact, are going to address food security in the Sahel as a long-term challenge, because if it's been chronic for this long, it's going to take an enormous effort not to make it chronic. I do have to disagree with Mira on one piece of one of her slides. She noted economic recovery, and I really don't think that's enough. Not for the Sahel. It's already too poor. It's already too risky. It's already too vulnerable. Economic recovery is not enough. Economic prosperity has to be the common purpose that is sought. And that means that we need to look at productivity, we need to look at resilience, we need to be more explicit, and this is where the tools of analysis are going to be helpful. Look at climate change, environmental degradation, and we need to look at structural issues, as I think many of the speakers have underscored. We need to look at research and development, which was also not mentioned. We need to look at infrastructure. We need to look at functioning of markets. We need to look at managing financial risk. In fact, if people are going to be asked to invest in infrastructure, to invest in expanded irrigation, to invest in new production endeavors, they also need to know that they're going to be able to manage their financial risks, and that to some extent is linked with climate risk, but it's also linked with market risk. The governance issue, I think, has been well underscored by several speakers. The last two sort of wildcard issues that I think have been mentioned both by questioners and by panelists have been the political issues. And I thank Ben for his very helpful summary of some of the real political wildcards out there.
Boko Haram, the return of Nigerian oil workers from Libya. Those are really big unknown factors that I think need to be on the screen for people to address. I think Ben also, in one of the questioners, underscored some of the cultural issues that may be there as complicating factors. So I think that this challenge, not just of economic recovery, but of really aggressively pursuing economic prosperity, which will relieve the underlying chronic condition against which this brewing crisis is playing out, is absolutely essential. I thought Greg finished up with kind of the core problem for most of you probably who represent various organizations, and that is really the rational allocation problem. How do you do all this? Mm-hmm. It seems very daunting as you listen to targeting, using different kinds of interventions to meet the immediate need, making these long-term investments, coordination, integration. This is not easy stuff organizationally to do. And I think one of the questioners mentioned, will the L'Aquila commitment of additional financing be maintained in this time of sort of continued global financial uncertainty, particularly emanating out of Europe, but also the U.S. So with that, I think I've kind of tried to summarize what I heard as some of the key messages, some of the key concerns, some of the key areas that I think provide a really solid basis for action going forward. And I want to finish by thanking Steve McDonald and the Wilson Center for partnering with the Partnership to Cut Hunger and Poverty in Africa in bringing these issues to the table and engaging so many people in the practitioner community here in Washington, and Ben out there in Australia in this discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Emmy. We really appreciate your summing that up. It was wonderful. I want to make a quick thank you as we close to the staff of Partnership, Rachel up here, and to Michelle McNabb for your wonderful work with us on this. My own staff, Derek and Ali and Mam Hadi, who I don't see right now. To John Sewell for another marvelous job on your side, and all the panelists, thank you again.